Sure. So Sam Tannahill. My title is Director of Winemaking and Viticulture at A to Z Rex Hill. I find myself the more we move down in winemaking, the more the years go by. I do a lot of different things other than viticulture and winemaking. However, I am ultimately responsible for the quality of the wine that comes out of this winery. We have an interesting operation here in that we really have 4 wineries under one umbrella. Sorry for all the noise. We've got those guys filling barrels, but. We have A to Z Wineworks, which is the name of our whole company, and we have A to Z Winery, which is the largest part of our organization. That A to Z this year we made about 240 to 250,000 cases, and that's sold all around the world, mainly Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris, but also we make Chardonnay, Riesling, and Rosé. And those are all under $20 wines, under 15 for the whites, under 20 for the reds. Then we have Rex Hill Winery, which is our high-end wines. It would be what I'd call almost a classic Oregon winery. It's a site-specific, mostly Pinot Noir, a little bit of Chardonnay, a little tiny bit of Pinot Gris based winery, 10,000 cases. The majority of that being our Willamette Valley Pinot Noir, and then a little bit of single vineyard Pinot Noirs, and once again some Chardonnay and Pinot Gris. Then we have Hatcher Wineworks, which is my partner Bill's label. He first got started making his own label in 2001 or 2002. I can't remember which was his first vintage. 2002, I believe. And he makes one wine, a Pinot Noir, usually around 400 to 500 cases, and that's it. And it's a blend of 4 to 6 vineyards. And then we have Francis Tannahill, which is my last name and my wife's last name combined, and that we started in 2001, and that's sort of evolved into our laboratory where we test certain philosophical ideas about wine. And so that's certainly our more esoteric winery, very small production on some things. For instance, all of our wines there are 100% whole cluster. Reds and whites are very traditionally made. As a matter of fact, I'm doing a skin contact Pinot Gris right now that I was just tasting, that's fermented actually out in the vineyard that it came from. And we do Grenache, and we do Syrah, and we do Gewürztraminer, and we do Pinot Noir, and we do Chardonnay. Basically, we find very small vineyards of older vines that are tended the way we want them to be tended. We also have our own vineyard, which goes with the label, and then we create these wines by really adding nothing. Sometimes it works out, and sometimes it doesn't. What's really great about having A to Z is that we can experiment at all these different levels, and if something doesn't quite work out or doesn't fit within one of the programs, it can go to A to Z. Whereas as a 1/10% addition to our Pinot Noir, it doesn't really make an impact on quality. So we have this wonderful opportunity to do that.
So why is it you have sort of a unique niche in Oregon wine with the kind of the price point and kind of the affordable and the scale of A to Z? Why is that important, or what role does that play in?
I think it's huge. When we started A to Z in 2002, it was a collaboration between two families, still is, but it was Deb Hatcher and Bill Hatcher and myself and my wife Cheryl Francis. And Bill was at Domaine Drouhin. I was running a consulting business, making wines for Shea Wine Cellars, and also had been at Archery Summit as their winemaker. And my wife was at Chehalem as their winemaker. And we got together, my wife and I and Bill and Deb had the same ideas, but at two opposite locations. We didn't know we had the same idea, and that was to buy wine, negociant style, from different wineries around Oregon and make the highest end quality that we could make at the cheapest price point, and try to be really light on our feet. And one day Bill and Deb and I were tasting in the cellar, this one cellar together in a winery, tasting the same wine that we were looking at buying. And then Deb and Bill called me up that night, called Cheryl and I up that night and said, hey, this is silly, we should join forces and make one wine together. And we said, great. So that was number one, to make this inexpensive wine at a great price and to use the bulk wine that was available out on the market. I think the other thing that really helped with our success, and we were really the first winery in Oregon to do that, to make that our sole mission. And the other thing that really helped us out was that we decided not to sell any wine, or a very limited amount of wine in Oregon. We saw the numbers that at that time in 2002, 60% of all Oregon wine was sold in Oregon and 40% was sold elsewhere in the United States. So we saw this great opportunity to get our wine out across all the United States, to Japan even. And the contacts that we'd made at our old business, we called up and said, hey, we've got this great project, are you interested? And they said yes. And so, after 3 months when we had sold out, we sat down together at Christmas and we said we should really continue this thing. It was only going to be a one-time thing to fund our smaller wineries, and it just kept steamrolling.
What have you kind of found or seen sort of a change in the industry, or other people kind of following along now that you've done that? Or
yeah, it's funny. I was just talking about this to someone else who was the head of the business school at Linfield College in McMinnville is doing a survey of Oregon wine and consumers and their appreciation of Oregon wine. And about, I think it was 2 weeks ago, I was at a market, I think it was Fred Meyer or Safeway or something like that, and I went over to the Oregon wine section just to take a look, and there were probably 15 selections of Oregon wine, Oregon Pinot Noir, between $15 and $20. Now when we got started, we were the only one. So it's just amazing to see the expansion of Oregon wines in that price category. However, this being Oregon, it's a really tough price category to play at. I wonder how many of those wines are simply discounts from a more expensive price point, or how much margin those wineries are making on those wines. I know extremely well the cost of our business, and it's tough to make a really good quality wine that you can sell retail at $18 from Oregon Pinot Noir. It's just difficult with the yields, with the way we farm, with the way the wine is made, the care and the handling that you need to take with it. It's a really tough job. So yes, I'm seeing expansion in that market. We certainly saw it during the financial crisis, but I wonder how much of that was discounted to get into that price point. But we are evolving, and I think it's important for Oregon as a state to move to a much more complete and perhaps balanced industry. For a long time we were dependent, or one of the exclusive wines that we sold was expensive Oregon Pinot Noir, and we really need to expand that to include value not only at $30, $25, $30 and above, but we also need it to include value at $15 and above. I think it's very difficult to almost impossible to get below $10, especially for red wine in Oregon. You might be able to do it for whites, but to get quality red wine for below $10 in Oregon is just I don't think we do it.
Do you feel any sort of responsibility kind of moving into those out-of-state markets, which are probably critical for the future of Oregon, sort of responsibility as an ambassador for Oregon? Or
Absolutely. We see ourselves as a gateway, baking the gateway meat, right? We see ourselves as the gateway for Oregon wines, and I think that some people in the industry see us that way as well. They say, well, that's great. If you're making a great wine at a good price point, people are going to drink it. It's their first experience with Oregon, certainly in like smaller markets too, like Indianapolis or Minneapolis, whatever, and then they're going to move on and graduate to the more expensive wines. Now, they may not drink those more expensive Oregon wines every night, right? But they may continue to drink A to Z 4 nights out of the week, and then drink Oregon, more expensive Oregon Pinot Noir on a special occasion. And so, yeah, I really feel that responsibility. And in some ways, through I've been making wine now for 20 years. It's my 20th vintage, and to look back at those years, I spent a lot of those years, especially in the beginning, making very small amounts of very expensive wine that was scored very highly, and that's really rewarding. It's pretty cool. You get on the top 100 list, and you get to go to functions and go to Masters of Food and Wine, and and all that stuff. But in a lot of ways, it's so much more rewarding to be able to bottle 140,000 cases of an Oregon Pinot Noir that we can sell at $18 retail, that gets 90 points and gets out on the top 100 list and gets out to all over the United States and 9 countries. I mean, there's something that's infinitely more difficult about it and more rewarding. And the other thing that's pretty cool is those making of those smaller lots, the 300 case lots, the 500 case lots, is a pretty solitary venture. You certainly have people working in the vineyard, but when it comes into the winery, it's you as the winery. You're doing everything, right? So it's pretty solitary. But when you're making 250,000 cases, you've got a whole group of people that you're working with, and that's great. You have to really check your ego at the door, and it's a really great feeling to have so many great people working with you to produce something that's so good.
Going back to your personal experience, when did you kind of first, maybe not even realize that you wanted to make wine, but when was the first time you kind of recognized wine as something more special than just something you drink with dinner or something like that? Or is it anything in your family history or any experiences that you go back to where you said, wow, okay, this is where I first kind of noticed wine for the first time?
Sure. I grew up in San Francisco, and so my family was always passionate about food, and to a certain extent about wine. My father loves wine, still does. My mother loves wine. I considered wine as something we had as a part of our normal dinner, our normal daily habits. Certainly, I wasn't drinking with my parents. It was always part of our life, but it wasn't a huge part. It was. I remember going up to Napa with my dad and sitting in the cars and big old green station wagon when I was a kid driving up to Napa, and I really hated it because I couldn't go into the tasting rooms. I had to sit outside with my sister while they went in and got to taste wine and whatnot. And I worked in a wine shop during high school during the summers to get some spending money. And I really, for me, working there during high school was just a job. I knew wine a little bit, but it really was just a job. And then I went to college, majored in something else, and then moved to Los Angeles, where I was moving there to be with a girlfriend, and started in Los Angeles. Horrible place. I shouldn't have said that. My wife's from Los Angeles, so. But I was there for about a year and a half. But in that time, I was working at this wine store, and I was exposed to a wide variety of wines. So there, people would come up and they'd spend thousands of dollars on a bottle of 59 Petrus or bottles of DRC or whatever. And the great thing about it is I was able to taste a lot of wines in that period. And that's where I realized that wine was incredibly special, and that I wanted to be involved with wine for the rest of my life. I didn't really know how I wanted to be involved, if it was wine sales or production or whatnot, but I knew I wanted to be involved for the rest of my life. And I can't name that. I can name the defining moment that I decided to be a winemaker, but I can't name that defining moment where wine became so important to me. I think it was more gradual. I've always liked music. I've always appreciated art, and I'm not an artist, and I can't play any instrument except maybe the drum sometimes if I'm lucky, the one single drum. But wine had an avenue for me that would offer an artistic expression combined with a craft that was, and plus we always say the lifestyle, and I think a lifestyle of a winemaker is really tough, or even a wine salesperson is really difficult, but there's also a lot of benefits to it as well, and not just that you get to eat and drink well, but just lots of intangibles as well. You get to work with something that's produced from nature and that's alive, and that's pretty cool. Yeah.
So you did mention that you can kind of trace that point where you decided that you wanted to be a winemaker. So How did that come about? How did that decision?
Well, I was still trying to figure out what I wanted to do. My girlfriend had left. We'd fallen out of love, and I'd actually stayed in Los Angeles, and she took off. Once again, I had majored in East Asian studies, so I was planning to go into international business. My dad worked for IBM his whole life. I was ready to head that way, and this sojourn in Los Angeles was just a few month sort of holding period while I was waiting for my girlfriend to graduate from UCLA. But once again, fell in love with wine, knew I wanted to leave LA. I was right during the riots, and after the riots I said, I got to get out of here, but didn't really know what I wanted to do or where I wanted to go. And we happened to have a dinner that night, not that night, but one night, with a guy named Andrei Chelichev, who's sort of the dean of California winemakers, made BV private reserves for years. I think he started in the 30s and made the wines up there, certainly as a consultant up through the 80s, was known as also one of the founders of the Washington wine industry, just an amazing guy. And so we had this dinner at the wine store honoring his 80th birthday. and we tasted these Cabernets back to the 50s, and he was going through each one. And what really struck home with me is he wasn't saying, okay, well, this one we harvested at 23 bricks, and it was 18 months in 50% new French oak, and oh, look at the flavors of tobacco and cassis are really amazing. He didn't really talk about that. He talked about his life. You know, this wine, this was the vintage where I met my wife and you know, decided that we were going to get married, and this was the vintage that we had this wonderful intern from so and so, and this is the vintage my dog died, and he was able to take this and share these experiences that weren't just natural experiences, but his own experience encapsulated in that bottle, and not only give people an insight into his life or show him a picture of his life, but allow people to taste what had been so integral in his life. And that experience of him opening those wines was different for him than it was for those people tasting those wines, but it was the same at the same time. And the wines came from different vintages, so even though they were made in the same way from the same vintage, they were all different. And I thought that was great. And I went home that night and I said, I want to be a winemaker. And as a matter of fact, I still have that menu hanging on my office wall with his signature, you know, to Sam, thanks a lot, Andrei Chelichev. And that was the moment I decided I want to be a winemaker.
So what did you do next?
Well, I set out to try to find a job. And wanted to go to Europe because, you know, in my mind at that point, that was where all the best wines were being made. And I enjoyed Pinot Noir, but I wasn't really super focused on it. I was really more looking for a job. As a matter of fact, I was really into Syrah and thinking that I could grow great Syrah in the California Sierra Nevada foothills because there's a lot of granite there. You know, at this point I'm reading all these books, and there's lots of granite and Hermitage and volcanic soils, and I thought, oh, this is gonna be great. And I happened to call my old girlfriend, we're still in touch, and I said, hey, I'm looking for this job. And one of her mom's good friends is a guy named Josh Jensen from Clara Winery. And so I said, you know, they got me in contact with Josh, and I said, hey, if there's any help that you can give me, that'd be great. I'd love to find a place to work. So at that point, I took off from Los Angeles and bought a one-way ticket to Thailand, and with this sort of vague idea that I was going to travel around Southeast Asia and wind up somewhere. I really didn't know where at that point. The first night I got to Thailand, the second night I got to Thailand, I met this fellow who had gone overland from England all the way to Thailand. And I decided that was something I wanted to do, so I forgot all my plans going to other Southeast Asia, and I flew to Nepal, and then I made it from Nepal to France without taking a plane after that point. It was an amazing trip, but when I was in India, I got this is back before email or whatnot, I got a telegram at the American Express office in, I think it was New Delhi, saying, you know, Sam, I've gotten you a job at a winery called Domaine de l'Arlot for harvest in Burgundy, you know, in Primo, a wonderful domain. I think you'll really enjoy it. You know, signed Josh Jensen. So I thought, great. So I went through India, and I got through Pakistan and Uzbekistan and Russia and whatnot. So I wound up in France, and I call Jean-Pierre de Smet, the general manager, partner at Domaine de l'Arlot, and this had been, I think, 3 or 4 months in the meantime. And I introduced myself, and I said, well, who are you? And I said, you know, Josh Jensen, job? Oh, yeah, come on up. So my father was living in France at the time, and I was down in the south of France with him, and I took a train. I wound up in Beaune, and Jean-Pierre's wife came and picked me up and brought me to the winery. And I'd never worked in a vineyard before. I barely knew any French. And they said, okay, well, you know, you're here for the next few weeks. Take an apron. We're getting the vines ready to harvest. And they drove me out to Romani Saint Vivant, dropped me off with the rest of the crew. And that was it. And I was right across the street from Romani Conti, and I'm working in Romani Saint Vivant. And I thought, holy crap, this is amazing. And so I did my first harvest there in 1993. And at the end of harvest, I said, this is really great. I really love it here, and this is wonderful. And Jean-Pierre said, well, you should certainly stay a year and figure out what you want to do. You really need to see the whole year. So I renovated this old house that was next to the distillery on the property, and stayed a year. And Jean-Pierre had previously worked with Jacques Hess at Domaine de Jacques, and I was very good friends with him. So we got to taste these amazing cellars. I tasted a lot at Lafon, Roumier, and Griveau, and Dujac, and Rouleau, and these wonderful wineries. And after a year, second harvest, I said, well, this was really great, but I need to go to school. And he said, well, yeah, I'm really good friends with the person that runs University of Dijon. You know, here I'll Professor Fouillard, I'll hook you guys up. And so, right, you know, next 2 weeks, I was at school at the University of Dijon, where I received a winemaking degree.
How was your French by that?
It was good at that point. I took all my exams orally because my written French was awful and is still awful. But yeah, you learn pretty quickly when someone's screaming at you in French, you know, get the pump, and you have no idea what they're saying, and you learn pretty fast. Yeah, but I spent, you know, I was a vineyard worker. I was making less than $1,000 a month. I was working in the winery and in the vineyard, but mostly in the vineyard. I was pruning, I was pulling brush. For 2 years while I wasn't going to school, and at the same time I was tasting as much as I could. There were a few Americans that were not necessarily in my my position, but that were working in Burgundy or around, and we, you know, got together and did a lot of tasting, and there were some younger Burgundians like Nicolas Potel that we got to hang out with and taste a lot of wines, and it was an invaluable experience. It was great.
So then how did that toward Oregon and the Willamette Valley?
Well, it's just sort of a strange story, but at the end of 1993, we were visited at the winery at Domaine Orleau by a guy named Gary Andrus and his winemaker Stacy Clark, and I had gone out that year and done a second harvest. So, you know, there's the second crop that's left higher up in the canopy, and I'd gone out and made a barrel of barrel of Burgundy by myself by like going down rows. I mean, it's just a minute amount of the total crop, but I was going to do it, and so that I finished picking my last grapes. It took me like 5 or 6 days to get all the grapes. My last days picking by headlamp because it was so dark in the winter, and I got into the winery, had dinner with Jean-Pierre and his wife Lilo and Gary and Stacy. At the end of dinner, Gary said, "Well, you know, we've got this project up in Oregon. Do you want to be a part of it? Do you want to, you know, come over and work harvest?" And I said, "You know, Gary, thanks very much, but I'm just committed to staying another year here, so I'm not going to be able to do it." And he said, "Okay, you know, it's great." And we lost contact. And then in 1995, I was ready to go back to the States. I was looking for a job, and I happened through Jacques Cess to get introduced to a guy named Ted Lemon, who's got a small winery called Littorai down in California. And Ted had done the exact same thing that I had done, except he was actually the winemaker at Rouleau. I think it was in it's either 83 and 84, or 82 or in 83. It was 82, 83. And he went through the same program at the University of Dijon that I did. And so I called Ted up, wrote him a letter and said, "Do you need a harvest intern?" And he said, "Yeah, great, you know, come on down, we'll love to have you. I've got a consulting business in my own winery. We're consulting for several wineries, and there's a winery up in Oregon that we're consulting for, but I can't really tell you what it is." And so at that point, I in the summer, flew back to the United States, went to, and I think it's important to note, I know I'm going on, but it's important to note that in 1994, I came to the IPNC, International Pinot Noir Conference, representing Domaine de l'Orleau in Oregon. And I fell in love with Oregon, and I thought within 2 years I want to be back in Oregon. This place is great. It's just like Burgundy. Really wonderful people. I remember at a dinner that I went up to at the Ponzi's and met Eric Homaker and Louisa Ponzi, and we're still friends with them. And it was I was like, boy, this is where I want to be. So I started working with Ted. And I took a month and a half off and lived in a tent in Jackson Hole, my friend's backyard, working at this wine shop in Moose, Wyoming called Dornan's. It's amazing. And the last party, we were having a going away party, and I drank this bottle of Archery Summit Pinot Noir, 1993. And this wine shop was the only wine shop in the whole state of Wyoming to get a 6-pack. And I tasted the wine. I thought, this is great. This is the best Oregon wine I've ever tried. And at that point, flew down, moved into Ted's house, was living with Ted and his wife Heidi, and he said, "Well, you know, here's the project that we're doing in Oregon. It's a winery called Archery Summit. So why don't we go up and check it out?" So we got on the plane, re-met Gary, flew up to Archery Summit, and by the end of the 1995 harvest, I was working at Archery Summit. The winemaker at the time was a guy named Grant Taylor, who was he's from New Zealand and was just there part-time in 1995. And so literally when he left, I flew up there. And the building was just being completed. 93s and 94s were made down at Pine Ridge Winery down in California. And in the 95 harvest, all the railing in Archery Summit was still 2x4s, and construction was still going on the crush deck. And I finished off the white wines up at Archery Summit, and never looked back. So that's how I got back up to Oregon. I owe a lot to a lot of people, and I'm still in contact with Ted. I still talk to him from time to time, and it was just a great experience.
Well, is there any sort of a kind of fate or anything? Do you put stock in that, how everything kind of winds back or leads you, kind of seems like a circular path? Or
yeah, I don't know if it's fate, but and I hate using the word luck, because I think everybody makes their own luck in a way. I'm a really goal-oriented person, and so I set these goals for myself. And one that I set when I was in Burgundy is that by 30 years old I wanted to be a winemaker in Oregon with my own vineyard, and I got there by 30. And so I do think there is some fate, and I have to tell this one story, because it is also very circular and sort of interesting, the way I met my wife. So I had the winery I worked for, Domaine de l'Arlot, was across the street from Domaine Rion in Burgundy, and one night I had a dinner with this guy Matt Donaldson. Matt Donaldson is a winery owner down in New Zealand. He has a winery called Pegasus Bay, a really great winery. And I just met Matt that one night. We invited him over. We had wild boar chops, drank a lot of wine, had a great night. But he was leaving the next day to go back down to New Zealand. So he flies off and goes to New Zealand. At that time, my wife Cheryl, who had gone to Lewis and Clark, was working at a winery called Veritas, which is now where Chehalem was or is. And she was getting set to go to New Zealand because she wanted to do harvest. So she went down and she started working at Pegasus Bay. Then another friend of mine, Mike Wirsing, he's got a small vineyard in New Zealand called Pyramid Valley Vineyard. But at that point, he was going around Burgundy, working in many different locations, many different wineries. He went to go visit James Halliday down in Australia to work with him, and I said, well, if you get to New Zealand, you got to go to Pegasus Bay. There's this great guy that runs it. So he goes to New Zealand, he goes to Pegasus Bay, and one night they're all having dinner, and my name comes up. And Matt is like, oh, Sam's a great guy. And Mike said, Sam's a great guy, Cheryl. You should meet this guy, Sam. This is absolutely unbeknownst to me. So then I go back to California, and Cheryl comes to France to work at Domaine Rion. So she's working across the street from me. After I left, she meets the gardener who's working at Domaine de l'Arlot, and he says, oh, Sam's this great guy, really neat guy. And then when I was in California, I met a guy named Blair Walters, who's a winemaker at Felton Road Winery. And at that point he was at Newton, and he knew Cheryl, and he said, oh, you got to meet this woman Cheryl, she's great. So then I left California to come up to Archery Summit just as Cheryl was going through Napa for a going away party with Blair, and he said, you got to meet Sam. So Cheryl gets hired at Chehalem, I get hired at Archery Summit, and we're having lunch, and she'd known that I was working for Archery Summit. She was visiting a friend in Utah and was at a microbrewery, and this guy said, well, do you know my stepdad, this guy Gary Andrus? He's just hired this new winemaker named Sam working for him. And she's like, God, who is this guy? We had never met. And we're at Tina's in Dundee one spring day in 1996, having lunch, and Gary, being Gary, had brought out all these Romney Contis, and we're tasting them, and we're leaving, and I hear this Sam, and I turn around, and it's Cheryl's boss had yelled my name, but she was too embarrassed to do it, and there was Cheryl, and we met and haven't been apart since. So yeah, there's a lot of circular things that have brought me to Oregon, to say the least.
With all of this kind of building you up, did you feel any pressure to kind of live up to the expectations? No. As a matter of fact, my first date, I really bungled it, but she forgave me, and we moved on from there. Yeah, that's it sounds like work laid for that meeting for sure.
It was amazing. I mean, literally across the street in Burgundy, missing each other by days in Napa, and I sort of feel that life is a series of coincidences sometimes, or I think decision points, and there were a few decision points along my life that I can point to, and one was deciding to make wine with that dinner with Andrei Chelichev. The other was literally deciding to turn around at Tina's, and the other was the day that Bill and Deb and I tasted together at that one wine at the winery we were going to buy wine.
Well, one of the kind of decisions that you've invested a lot in is kind of going in the direction of sustainability and biodynamics, and we talked a little bit about that before, but what's your kind of what's the appeal, and why did you first decide to explore biodynamics?
It's interesting. We just had a panel for this for the American Society of Wine Educators, and there were 3 biodynamic winemakers, and I was asked sort of the same question. And I think what first got me interested in biodynamics was in France. There were a few people in France that were vineyardists, or winemakers farming biodynamically for quite some time. Nicolas Joly in Loire Valley, Marc Angely in the Loire Valley. Was it Marc Angely? I think it's Marc. Kreidenweiss in Alsace. But in Burgundy, it was really just starting out. You had Lafon doing some, you had Domaine Leflèvre, you had Pascal Marchand, you had DRC that were just starting out in Burgundy at that time. And I found most of the wines that I was tasting that I really enjoyed and I thought were really complete and complex and had a sense of, the French call it nervosité. I've translated it loosely because nervousness doesn't really work. I translated more to integrity. There was a sense of place and integrity in the wine. And they tasted alive were coming from biodynamic producers. So I think I came at it from a qualitative standpoint. And then as I dove deeper into the subject, I realized that it made a lot of sense, and it harkened back to some of my earlier thoughts on agriculture that I had learned from certain people being in California, the planning on the moon phases and the astrological signs. And so that's just sort of dovetail, but really quality is what brought me to biodynamics. And for a long time, it was sort of put on the shelf. I had read about it, I had studied it, tasted a lot of the wines, but I never really had the ability to practice it exclusively. We did a little bit at Archery Summit, but not really much. And then when my wife and I bought our own property, we decided we were going to farm it biodynamically, and that was sort of the first point, starting in 1998. So of course I called up the person that I consider my mentor, Ted Lemon, and I said, well, Ted, who can I call that can teach me a little bit more about biodynamics? There's a group up here in Oregon that are really good, but no one's really working in vineyards, biodynamically in vineyards in Oregon. At that point, they're really, Cooper Mountain was one, and there were a few people just getting started, but not that many. So he said, look, there's this great guy I'm working with, a guy named Andrew Loran, you should come down and meet him. So my wife and I flew down to Santa Rosa and met with Andrew and got him to come up to Oregon, and he started consulting for our property. And then we started a class with like-minded students of biodynamics. Jimi Brooks was in there, Patrick Reuter from Dominio was in there, I think Archery Summit. That was before I left Archery Summit, so I started Archery Summit, then Lee Bartholomew came in, and we had a group going where we were learning not only the agriculture course, but also How to Know Higher Worlds by Rudolf Steiner. And that's when I think I started to get really involved in it and I began to understand it a lot more, and realizing that perhaps biodynamics doesn't necessarily answer all the questions that I have, but at least it was asking a lot of questions, and it was seeking not only to I think arrest the degradation that we were seeing out in our vineyards, but it was trying to reverse it as well, which I thought was really great. And I thought that homeopathy for me was nothing unusual. My mom was sort of a hippie growing up, so we were natural medicine, and homeopathy was definitely a part of our life. We were already farming organically. And the other thing that really struck home is, I didn't want my vineyard workers nor the people drinking my wine to be exposed to some of these chemicals that people are in conventional vineyards are spraying on their vineyards. So at that point, it became less of a qualitative decision and more of a decision of morality and conscience. And I embrace it wholeheartedly. We've been doing it for a long time. We're not the largest biodynamic farmer in Oregon. I think Mo Momtazi is quite large, as is, boy, I just saw his face, Montenor. But we're farming about 130 to 180 acres, depending on the year, biodynamically. A lot of them are certified now. We make all of our own preparations. And to me, Deb, my partner's got this, not really a poster, but a saying up on our wall in her room, and it's, make no small plans. So I thought, if we're going to do biodynamics, we're going to do it right and do it well. And I don't want to just buy preps from a place in West Virginia. I want to make all of our own preps. So now we have a biodynamic garden. We're growing all of our own herbs. We just finished making 500. So it's something that's really important to me. I'm seeing a qualitative change. I'm seeing the vineyards be less susceptible to any kind of weather event or stress event, I guess is the best way to put it. I think the other thing that I'm seeing is healthier vineyards. I like the idea of biodynamics looking as increasing the immune system for a certain vineyard. I think that's really great, and I think that's really sensible to me. The other thing I think moving forward is I think it's important to me now that we view biodynamics, in my mind, as a step, not as an end. It's a means to get to the end that we want. And the end that I want is a fully integrated vineyard that lives within and with its environment that surrounds it. And I think if you have that, you're much able to resist disease, you're much more able to resist climate change, you're much more able to resist insect pests coming in. And I think now I view biodynamics in some ways as a step to get to a fully integrated vineyard. And I think that that's really the way I'm going now. It's biodynamics when you have the spiritual side, the physical side, the energetical side. The spiritual side is always the one leap that's sort of hard to go across coming from most backgrounds in the United States. But the energetical side and the physical side you can really see. And once again, I think it's a step to get to where we want to be. Vineyards are monoculture. No matter what people say that they have cows in a different pasture or they do cover crops or whatever. I mean, we're planting a vine that in nature would find its way into a tree and grow unhindered up through the tree branches to present its grapes to the passing birds. We've made like these miniature bonsai caricatures of a vine, and we're taking clones, which are actually sort of like copies of copies of copies of copies. And when you take copies of copies of copies, that the ultimate quality begins to disintegrate. And for me, that's what vineyards are. When you talk about these clones, right, and propagating them from not from seed, but from taking a branch and making a graft, you're making a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. So you're inherently raising a weak plant in a foreign to its situation. I think about cities. When you pack so many people in the cities and there's new strains of tuberculosis or other diseases cropping up in the cities, of course, you pack too many people in together, you're going to get these things, and they're not healthy, and they're not eating right. You're going to get strains of diseases that take advantage of those openings that people leave them. The same exact thing with vineyards. You're packing all these vines together. They're on a diet of chemicals, of antibiotics, and so it's my job, I feel, to try to wean them off that and to get as healthy of a vineyard as possible. I think if you have the healthiest vineyard as possible, you're going to have healthy vineyard workers, and you're going to have people that are more healthy drinking your wine as well. And then I think quality is going to be superior as well.
Do you meet with skepticism, or did you meet with skepticism because people hear about some of the things that are kind of foreign to them, some of the tenets that are strange. So I guess what are some of those aspects that cause people to look at it skeptically, and then did you experience any of that skepticism?
You always experience some of that skepticism. One of the funniest stories I have about biodynamics is at the local Fred Meyer, which is our sort of the supermarket chain here in Oregon and Washington. There's this natural food section, right? That's all organic sort of stuff, and then there was one section for a long time that said biodynamics, right? And I remember it first coming up, and I was like, biodynamics, it's great. It's really well known in Europe, but it's hardly known at all in the United States. And so I went there, and it was all products that could be used in a septic system, like decomposing toilet paper and all that other stuff. So I mean, even the word is foreign to a lot of people, and everybody has this conception of biodynamics as hippies dancing naked underneath the full moon, right? I mean, it's really far from that. I think as a culture, America has disconnected itself from natural rhythms and cycles in agriculture. And I think that was brought about by the military-industrial complex after World War I that had an excess of all these chemicals that they converted into fertilizers, and developed these chemical fertilizers that people started using on their fields, and also the development of a tractor in some ways that isolated you or the farmer from the environment. And when you have these fertilizers that you can use and put on, and you have irrigation, flood irrigation, you can in some ways, in some regions, bend agriculture to your system, to plant it X days from harvest, to make it more fit into a cycle that humans live in. I mean, think about, running from your heated or air-conditioned house to your heated or air-conditioned car to your heated or air-conditioned office in a city full of concrete. There's a lot of people, I'd say the vast majority of people in the United States, that never really see nature in its own environment their whole lives. And I think it's through that disconnect that people have forgotten that the basic tenets of biodynamics make sense. The farming by astrological signs, people have been doing that for centuries, right? But we all think it's weird because we've disconnected ourselves so radically from that tradition. There's a series of books that were published in the early 70s called the Foxfire books, and it's sort of about mountain life in Appalachia. And you think about like the anti-Rudolf Steiner, it's probably, you think about mountains in West Virginia and whatnot. But one of the books, one of the chapters is farming by astrological signs, right? So people were doing this in America from the 1800s, thinking it was normal. I mean, this is the way people farm. They noticed, because if they planted something at the wrong time and it wasn't fruitful or less fruitful, they starved. And so they took extreme care to notice the details of when they planted, what the astrological signs they were doing, because they didn't really use calendars. They're using the astrological signs or the sun and the moon to tell the time. They didn't have wristwatches, and so they took extreme care of when they planted that would yield the best and highest quality produce. Because they needed that to survive. When I talked to my old girlfriend's grandfather, who came over from Italy, he had these big sausage fingers and had farmed his whole life. He talked about planting garlic in the new of the moon and under this astrological sign. I mean, people have been doing this for a long time. So I think that astrological sign people view with skepticism because we've divorced ourselves from those natural rhythms so much. We go buy our meat in shrink-wrapped plastic packages. We don't go to butchers really anymore where the whole carcass is on display. We don't realize that people butchered hogs in the winter because it was easier to preserve the hams and whatnot through the winter, because if they did it in the summer, all that meat would spoil. So I mean, we've forgotten these sort of rhythms. The other thing that I think people view with skepticism in biodynamics is that energetical I mean, let's put the spiritual side aside right now, and it's the energetical thing that you're using energies when you farm, or trying to work with energies when you farm. I think the physical thing, most farmers can realize the physical things are there. You add something to your soil or something to your vineyard, and there's a reaction. That physical side's pretty obvious. But this energetical side, which takes into account the preparations, because preparations are simply the carriers of these energetical forces, right? And I think Rudolf Steiner did a good job by naming these preparations with numbers. If he called it chamomile stuffed into a cow's intestine, then buried for a certain amount of time, then taken up, people would view those with even more skepticism than they do now. But the energetical side, for me, it's as simple as, you plant a seed, that one little tiny seed, right? You put it in the ground and it grows up into a plant, something that can be eaten. I mean, to me, that's just amazing that from that one little, let's say a seed of corn, that one little corn kernel, it grows up into this tremendous plant that serves great nutritional value. All that energy is contained in that one little seed, all that DNA for its reproduction and its growth and its harvest is contained in that one little seed. And to me, that's pretty amazing. Rudolf Steiner said in 1924, he said, at the turn of the century, our tables will be loaded down with fruits and vegetables and food that will look gorgeous, that will be beautiful, that will be unblemished, that will be perfectly spherical, that will look really inviting but have zero nutritional value. And I think that he was really true with that. And I think that that energetical side, once again, if you actually go into nature, you can feel, this is where the energetical side and the spirituality side blurs to a little bit. I mean, is there spirituality or energy in a sunset or a sunrise? Is there one walking through an old growth forest in Northern California of redwoods? I mean, there's some amazing feelings that you get when you go in those places. And when you go into a wheat field or a vineyard that's conventionally farmed, I feel you don't get that feeling. You really need to go onto a special farm, biodynamically farmed farm, to really get that feeling. And I think, yes, so there is some skepticism, not as much as there was in the past. I think a lot of people don't understand what it actually is, and I think part of that skepticism really comes from this planting and farming to moon phases and astrological signs. But people have to remember that that's been going on for centuries. It's not new thinking, it's not hippie thinking, it's what people were doing long before there was conventional agriculture.
So are you kind of making decisions then on, so like with A to Z wines then too, so thousands and thousands of gallons,
well, the wine,
are you kind of making some like harvest decisions and big decisions based on that system, or?
You try to. I have some inherent difficulty with the calendar that was developed in Europe, applying it to the same conditions that we find here in the United States. So I try to. We certainly make, for our vineyards farmed biodynamically, we certainly make all the viticultural decisions based on that calendar. The picking, we are so challenged with weather up here that the picking we try to do is best that we can, but we're going to pick if it's pouring down rain, if we've got a lot of rain coming up. Certainly, some of these things, it makes sense, right? We always try to pick in the new of the moon when all the sap is being forced down into the roots of the plant, and the volume of the berry actually goes down, so you get a more concentrated wine. And I think you can see that just by looking at the tides, right? You've got high tide and low tide. You've got what I would call full moon is sort of a moon of watery forces. It's about growth. It's not about ripening. Where a new moon's about sort of this ripening and volatility, but volatility in a good way. This sort of aromatic volatility. In the winery, I always have a hard time sometimes connecting the biodynamics in the winery versus the vineyard. Rudolf Steiner never talked about what should be done in the winery. So I think that there's certain things that you can apply and certain feelings and thoughts that you can apply in the winery, but there's no direct translation. It's sort of like we've gone from a dimly lit room, right, to a room that's totally dark, and you're trying to feel around for what's in that room and get sort of a clear picture of it, but we're not really there yet. Whereas in this dimly lit room, which is biodynamics in my mind, you have this whole agricultural system that's founded on 8 lectures given to people that were steeped in the knowledge of Rudolf Steiner. I mean, he didn't give this to farmers from wherever farms. He was giving it to people that were his disciples, that were schooled in anthroposophy, that had come to him for years saying, please give us these lectures. And he finally did. He gave 8 out of 16, right? He never died before he gave the next 8. So to me, biodynamics is sort of a dimly lit room, but there's a lot of people in that room, and we're all trying to make it brighter. Whereas winemaking, it's like going into a dark room, and there's a few of us in there trying to feel our way and talk to each other about it and what we're doing. So it's hard for me to bring biodynamics in the cellar. However, if you believe in energetical forces and you believe that there's a connection between the vine and the wine, and that there's not just a product but energies that you're working with, I think there's certain paths that you can walk down that I'm trying to explore that hopefully will lead, in my mind, to more typical wines. And that to me is the goal of what I'm trying to do, is to make wines that can't be grown anywhere else, that can't be compared to anywhere else in some ways, because they are truly Oregonian from that particular vineyard. I want to find anything that I can do to increase the typicity of that wine. And when I don't mean a typical wine, I mean a wine of place. And so I think there's certain pathways that you can walk down to get there. But a lot of those pathways we're mapping out as we go. It's a tabula rasa right now.
What are some of the other, either that or other innovative things that you're just experimenting, you're kind of feeling around in the dark when you're doing it?
Well, I think the one thing that we were talking about was this. I think in winemaking, you have grape growing and you have winemaking, right? And there's a lot of things you can do in winemaking. There's a lot of things you can do in grape growing, but in a winery, there's certain techniques that you can use. There's oxygen you can play with. There's yeast you can play with. There's certain different products and whatever. And I think to make the most typical wine, you have to take a lot of that off the table. You have to limit your toolbox. You're limiting your toolbox when you work with biodynamics in the vineyard, right? You don't have all these chemicals, right? And you're trying to use natural products that you're making yourself, and not buying from somewhere else or not using these hard chemicals. The same thing you have to do in the winery is throw away a lot of that toolbox, so you're left with a smaller toolbox, but you have to think a lot about how to use those tools in that toolbox. And so in my mind, I think wood tanks are one thing that's while not necessary, help make a more typical wine, and part of that reason is the shape of them and the way the thermodynamics play out inside the fermentation, and we've studied all that and the tannin and extraction. But I also think that if you're a grape, and if you believe the grape is carrying an energetical force, right, and you're putting it in something as inert and cold as stainless steel, I think it's a real shock to it. Whereas if you're delivering it gently to the winery, like a lot of us do, and then putting it into a wood tank, it's easing it into something that's more natural. I've been trying to explore for a while making wood tanks out of Oregon oak, which I think would be great, which we haven't been able to achieve yet, but we do use Oregon oak barrels here. Another thing that I'm doing that we discussed was to take the wine that was fermented, that was harvested from a particular vineyard, to take the wine and ferment it back in that particular vineyard, and then to bury those barrels through the winter in that vineyard, hoping to sort of bring that wine, it sounds sort of strange, but to bring that wine back to where it was grown up. I mean, imagine, my wife and I were talking about this last night in the context of moving, but when we go down to San Francisco, where I'm from, or go down to Los Angeles, where she's from, she always goes back by the house that she grew up in, or I go back by the house that I grew up in. I think a lot of people do that when they go to the city that they're from. And there's something it might be a small house, it might be a big house, it might be whatever, but there's an emotional connection to that place. And I think that in my mind, there is a energetical connection of that wine to the vineyard in which it was raised. And so either taking those grapes, the wine, back there to ferment, or actually taking part of the soil and bringing it back and putting it close to the tanks that are here at the winery, really does do something. It helps it connect it back from where it came from. We've talked about amphora. We're getting some amphora next year, and we're going to actually bury them in the vineyards in which we grow the grapes and ferment red grapes in the vineyards. I think there's just that connection. And once again, it's my search to try to find the most typicity I can, because I think that we owe it to our customers, our consumers, to make something that's truly unique and truly special. Now, there's a movement in the wine industry for natural wines and for wines without sulfur, and for wines that have a lot of skin contact, for instance, on Pinot Gris and whatnot. And to me in Oregon, there's no real, I used to do one in 2004 and 2005, I made a skin contact Pinot Gris, Chardonnay, Pinot Blanc that we buried in the ground, we dug up at Easter, and it had macerated the whole time. And I've sort of gone away from that, thinking that there's no real tradition of doing that in Oregon. There's a tradition of that in Georgia, and there's a tradition of that in Northern Italy, but not really in Oregon. So my idea is, how do we make Pinot Gris better? How do we make Pinot Noir better? Or not even better, but more representative of the site. So I think that we need to focus on figuring out how we can retain that connection of the grapes and the vineyard through the process of winemaking. I also think that the natural wine movement with no sulfur and whatnot, it's interesting. I've certainly made wines here without sulfur and bottled wines without sulfur. But I find far too often that natural winemaking is also an excuse for a winemaker not doing their job. I'm going to make natural wine, I'm not going to add anything. And to me, the winemaker's job is to shepherd the wine. And even at the best grass-fed cattle ranches, they don't let the cows just run out into the fields and then go find them 6 months later and bring them back and butcher them. There is an active shepherding. You've got to protect them against wild animals. There's fences. You have to make sure that they're healthy. And I think that that's an important job of a winemaker as well, is making sure that the wine is healthy and making those decisions that might not be the decisions they want to make at that particular time, but making those to protect the health of the wine. And I find too many natural wines are not really healthy to me. They may be healthy to drink, but they're not healthy wines. They're oxidized, or they're re-fermenting, or they're too cloudy. Now, that's a very generalization, because I've had a lot of natural wines that have been very pure and very, very beautiful. But I don't think, I think a devotion to any kind of dogma in winemaking is going to get you in, well, it's not going to get you in trouble necessarily, because you may appreciate those wines, but I think that it can lead to wines that are flawed, and that's the last thing I want to make, because to me, that flaw then takes over the character of the wine. It's like talking to a person, where if that person has some small flaws or some difference in personality, that's what makes that person interesting. That what makes them fun to talk to or fun to hang out with. But if that flaw becomes way too evident and takes over that person's personality, that person becomes a sociopath, or or whatever you want to call it. And they're no longer okay to hang out with, and they're no longer fun to talk to. And I think that's what makes us good people, is all the facets and the nuances, but not having any one of those facets or nuances or flaws, we're all flawed, take over their whole personality. And that's, for me, with wine, is you can have what would be traditionally considered flaws, maybe a little elevated VA or EA or a little bit of Brettanomyces or whatever. But if those are small facets making a complex whole, that for me is the most complex wine. If you have one of those facets, be it VA or aldehydes or Brettanomyces or Pediococcus, taking over the whole character of the wine, it becomes about that flaw. It no longer becomes about that wine or where that wine was grown.
Well, you kind of bring a philosophical approach, mentioned with, kind of sort of they're the generation of winemakers that came up here to prove that you could make Pinot Noir in the Willamette Valley against the odds and amidst a lot of skepticism. And then there's sort of the next generation of winemakers who kind of brought philosophical approach and sort of a level of crafts, experimental approach and that sort of thing. And so there's folks like yourself and Jimi Brooks is another person who kind of fits in that group, and he was part of your study group. Do you see yourself and Jimi kind of as sort of peers in terms of how you were?
Not anymore, but certainly back then, yes, definitely. Yeah, I mean, it's the wine business has certainly grown, and I know a lot of people say that, and I think every time we give an award to one of the pioneers at the Oregon Wine Board Awards dinner or the Oregon Wine Growers Association Awards dinner, they always say, boy, I remember when I first got here, you could walk in, there were 40 people, everybody would fit in one room, and now look at us, it's 300 people or whatnot. And so the wine industry has certainly grown, and I find that probably the group that we had would no longer be possible to start today, maybe. But certainly, Jimi was a peer. There were several other people in that group I find as peers, and I think that we benefited. I hate to use cliches, but we certainly stood on the shoulders of giants. I mean, the pioneers, David Adelsheim, David Adelsheim, Dick Ponzi, Dick Erath, Harry Peterson Nedry, Susan Sokolblosser. What we're doing now wouldn't be possible without what they did in the foundation that they laid. I think there was actually a second wave after that I would say was sort of the more investment and it's sort of a monetary wave that validated what the pioneers were doing, and that was sort of the Archery Summit, the Domaine Serene, the Domaine Drouin wave, and we saw some recapitalization of people like Adelsheim and a few other wineries, Ponzi, and then it was sort of my wave, which I think was able to take stock of all these things and really philosophically, like you were saying, look at it and achieve I think, great strides in sustainability during that wave. And really think about, we brought, I think, a skill set that was trained scientifically to be winemakers, going to schools, but we also brought an appreciation for sort of the weirder aspects of wine and trying to combine those two. You know, even though, you know, regardless of age, I count, you know, Doug Tannahill at Brickhouse among that group, Patrick Reuter, Jimi Brooks, Michael Stevenson at Panther Creek, Josh Bergstrom as sort of J.K. Carrier, Jim Prosser, sort of this group that's bringing that sort of viewpoint or attitude into the Oregon wine industry. And you know, I think now that there's another wave. You know, I think now that there's a wave of smaller, younger producers getting going that have small wineries and small projects at the same time being winemakers at another winery. I mean, I can't tell you how many people I know that are winemakers at a winery that also have their small independent labels as well. And I think a really great part of that is now we're seeing this sort of second generation taking over wine, the established wineries, which is great. Wynn Peterson Edry at Chehalem, Louisa Ponzi at Ponzi, and you're really seeing that second generation growing up and that have been here forever. And I think they have so much to offer this industry. They have that communal memory that I certainly don't have. I mean, I got here in '95, so I didn't grow up here. And talking to Louisa, it's really great to hear those stories and to see those traditions continue.
Now, do you kind of have visions? I know I
got a lot of visions, but
children, you know, your kids. Do you kind of see, kind of have hopes of them kind of being that second generation, or do you?
Yeah, you know, it's a blessing and a curse. When I was in France, I knew quite a few people that from small wineries and large wineries that were handed down from father to son. You know, I knew someone that was 19th generation father-son direct lineage in wineries. I knew someone that was 21st generation father-son direct lineage. And that's really great to have that institutional knowledge and that history reaching way back. But at the same time, I saw people in that position that were burdened by that tradition, they had to be a winemaker, they had to do the winery. They didn't have another choice. And so I think that this being America, it would be great to have our kids take over the winery and go into the wine business. And certainly we're raising them in an environment that is focused around the table, around friendship, being synonymous with food and wine. But if they decide not to, that's fine as well. You know, I think that's the great thing about America, is that you can really decide what you want to be. You don't have to be what your father did. And that's pretty cool. I mean, my father worked for IBM. You know, he hated it when I went to work in Burgundy. You know, he paid for my whole college, and to go see me squander away my life making $1,000 a month, he was furious. And then he came up to visit me when the Festival de Saint Vincent, which is the patron saint of wine in Burgundy, and each town has their own. There's one large festival, and then each town has its own festival. And we went to one of the small towns with a French friend of mine, and they carry the statue around the town, and it starts with a casse-croûte in the morning, and then it goes to a lunch that goes on, all day. And at the end of that weekend, my dad left, and he said, "Don't ever do anything else. This is great," And so it's I think it's wonderful. I don't know. It's that whole West Coast feeling of unlimited horizon, of newness, of being able to recreate or reinvent yourself, which I think has made this industry what it is. The pioneers in the industry all came from somewhere else, and that's back to the question about my kids. If my kids want to go in here, I'll support them. If they want to do something else, that's absolutely fine. This is my dream. This is not their dream, and I think if I imposed my dream upon them, it would become a burden as opposed to a gift.
Well, and that's interesting. I mean, one of those pioneers too is Jimi Brooks, in terms of somebody who, his own family,
right,
from what I've been interviewing, didn't even know kind of the depth of how well respected he was, right, in the industry, and and you mentioned sort of that kind of American dream and culture, and he kind of left the United States and thinking he might never come back to it, but then came right back as part of that, taking advantage of that. So how much did you know of kind of his backstory and
a lot. I mean,
philosophy?
I don't know. I can't tell you how many times, how many nights Jimmy and I were, spent together. I mean, I didn't meet him until '95 when I first 95, yeah, 96 actually, when he was the assistant winemaker at Willikenzie. But the day my wife and I met him at the same day, we just became fast friends. So I mean, I can't tell you how many Christmas Eves and New Year's we spent together and doing stupid things and talking and so yeah, I mean we're very close, and I think our philosophy was very much the same, and so I knew a lot about his backstory. I don't know what he would say now or what he does say now, with how much A to Z has grown. He'd probably laugh and try to hit me on the arm, but yeah, I mean, I definitely knew his backstory. Yeah, it was in some ways it paralleled mine quite a bit with the trip to Europe, thinking that he'd stay there for a long time, and then coming back and trying to create something new. And at that time in Oregon, and still now, you really have that opportunity to create something new. It's very difficult to do that in California now.
Would you mentioned that you kind of became fast friends when you first met?
Yep.
What was it? What was it about that you connected on? Or?
I don't know, when you find a brother that you never had, I mean, it's just that you share the same philosophy, you share the same aspects of life, you bond over food and drink, and the same things are important to you that are important, the same things that are important to me or important to Jimmy. It was like we'd known each other forever. The day that he died, actually, the night before he died, we had dinner at Tina's. Tina's is a really central focal point of my life as well. But I was living in McMinnville at the time, and then he and I, he came and picked me up, and we got in his car and drove to Dundee and had dinner with a group. It was, I think, about 8 of us. And then that next morning, my wife and I were offloading some cows that Jimmy and my wife and I were splitting, and we had a pasture that we had leased, and so we were, we were offloading 3 cows and kept calling and wondering where he was, because he was supposed to come meet us and help with the cows. And eventually we found out, obviously, that he had passed away that morning. But that's how close we were. I mean, it was, we were doing things absolutely in tandem, and we spent a lot of time together.
So yeah, and he was, quite young. So what was that? Was there like disbelief when you heard it?
Yeah, it was devastating. Yeah. It was it was pretty devastating. It was, I think that there's still repercussions, good and bad, from that. I think hopefully more good, but certainly I look back on my relationship with Jimmy with a lot of joy and love. But at the same time, there's a lot of melancholy and sadness with that as well. But I think there was, without Jimmy's passing, I wouldn't have become such great friends with his sister. I wouldn't probably, I have a couple of friends who, one's a winemaker, one's a distiller, Lee and Tad, that we get together every once in a while. We're getting together in the next couple of weeks. So I don't know if we would have gotten together and stayed this close that we have. So there's always a good side and there's always a bad side. Yeah.
What and certainly what Jamie brought her into an industry that she may never have been involved with.
Yeah.
And she's become sort of a fixture
Yep.
in this industry. When you first met her and heard that she was kind of get involved with the wine business, what did you think about that, and how has she kind of changed or become part of the scene?
It's hard for me to say how she's changed, because I never really knew her before. I mean, Jimmy had talked about her, but had never really known her. And I still remember that when we met her, we were all at Jimmy's house, and she just sort of showed up, and we said, okay, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to get through harvest. And I remember at Jimmy's service, it was up at the the vineyard. And then we all went down to his house, and a lot of restaurants brought food, and there were fire dancers and all that. And we had his Unimog, which is a big military truck, and we were sitting in the back of the Unimog, and I remember saying to Janie, you know, do you understand now? Do you see that this is how important Jimmy was to all of us, and this is how great this community is. And I think she really got it, and she's really become part of this community, and she's really made it her life, and I think that's really great, you know. And it's wonderful to see her thrive in this business. And it certainly wasn't easy. It was emotionally difficult, I think, financially difficult, but I think that she's turned all those corners and created something that maybe Jimmy might not have even created to this extent. And that's really great, and I think it's really great to honor his legacy that way. And also she's making it her own, which is really cool. It's not simply Jimmy's old winery that his sister Janie's running. No, it's really become Brooks. And even though it had its genesis with Jimmy, of course, it's evolved into something that's different.
You made sort of a decision with a group of other winemakers to kind of go in and help them get through harvest and provide support.
Yep.
Why would you do something like that? I mean, it's competitive, you know, competitors.
We don't have competitors here. I mean, I think we do, but you know, we have. I think at the heart of it, we're all friends, and we do anything for our friends. I mean, that's certainly the reason Cheryl and I did that, and Bill and Deb. You know, we couldn't not. Let's put it that way. And I think now we might view each other as, not Brooks, I'm saying, but in general in the Oregon wine industry, we view each other as more as comrades than competitors. You know, we all still get together. I mean, I think this industry has been founded on collaboration, and the Oregon wine industry, and this is still who we are. There's still, the Oregon wine industry, you know, you gotta understand, is small. It's a small wine industry. It's an important wine industry, but it's small. I think we sell less than 3 million cases a year, where someone like Gallo makes, you know, 75 million cases a year, which is great. I mean, I think, you know, Gallo's done amazing things. And there's a lot of things about Gallo actually to really admire. But at the same time, Oregon really fights above its weight class. You know, we're pretty small, and our importance is, our reputation is much greater than the actual amount of wine that we make. So it's not uncommon to have a meeting between, let's say, our winery, me and my partner Deb. We just went down and had lunch with Ed King from King Estate, who's probably, if you looked at it in traditional business sense, our main competitor, right? But we had a lunch with them saying, how can we work together? What can we collaborate on that's going to enhance not only both of our businesses but the whole industry, and that's going to, you know, the rising tide's going to float all boats. So I would really hesitate to use the word competitor here in Oregon ever. I mean, we are in a traditional sense, but there's so much market that's out there that's potential that I don't see us as competitors. I see more as comrades or collaborators. And yeah, I mean, I probably, as along with a few other people, helped Janie, probably told her some, you know, ways that we found success at our companies, helped her with quality of wine, explained certain things to her, talked to her about which vineyards to buy, you know, said, hey, I found this vineyard or these grapes, you guys should, you know, maybe look at them. That would boggle some people's minds in a traditional competitive marketplace. That would think, why the hell are you doing that with a competitor? But I would never view them as a competitor at all.
What kind of role does she play in the industry now? I mean, I've heard her story kind of mentioned, in Washington and California,
yeah.
and people talk about that story. Yeah. It's something that they know. So, what role does she play?
I would say she plays a leadership role in the Oregon wine industry. I wouldn't say that. The midpoint of Brooks, or after Jimmy's passing, is an extraordinary story. From 2004 to 2007, it's an extraordinary part of winery history, not only in Oregon but anywhere. I would say now, however, that Brooks is a very good, successful Oregon winery, and Janie plays a leadership role correspondent to that position of the winery, and nothing more, nothing less, but that's an important role that she plays. She's on board, she's active. Chris is active in OPC, and is active in the biodynamic community, and so I would hesitate. I hesitate to single Brooks out as like a special winery, because I think that puts them in a sort of weird classification. You should go to Brooks, you should drink their wines, you should appreciate wines for what they are, not because of the story that they went through. And I think that's been my whole philosophy also in winemaking, is that you shouldn't like our wines because we're biodynamic. You shouldn't like our wines because we use 100% whole cluster in wood tanks. You should like our wines because they're good and they're representative of the place. And the story you may relate to, and it may echo and resonate within you, but for me, hopefully that's secondary to the fact is we're making really good wines that really speak to the place. And I think that's what Brooks is as well. It's a cool story, but they're also, it's not just the story.
Is there sort of a was there a style or a personality that Jimi brought to the wines? There's a certain philosophy that you've brought in and qualities that you've talked about that you kind of shepherd in the wines, but could you taste a wine and be like, this is a Jimi Brooks?
Pretty close.
Wine.
I think that at that point we were all evolving our style. We still are to a certain degree. I think I've become a little bit more not set in my ways, but a little bit more sure of the style in which I want to continue. And I think at that time we were experimenting with a lot of different styles, a lot of different ways, how we made wine, what kind of style we wanted to find our wine with. I think if you were to look at an Archery Summit wine, for instance, and when I made Archery Summit wines and look at a wine that I'm making now, you'd certainly find differences. You'd find the same hand, but you'd definitely find differences. And so I would say now that the Brooks wines are firmly Chris's wines, and Chris has evolved and Chris has changed. But back when Jimi was the winemaker or the owner and doing everything, certainly there was a particular style of wine that Jimi had, especially at Momtazi wines and at Brooks wines. However, those styles we talked about incessantly. In fact, probably to most people really boring at a lot of the time, but we were really honing our style back then. I don't think we were really, our styles were still fairly broad, where I think they're getting more and more honed. And once again, I think now Brooks is certainly Chris's wines, for sure.
Do you recall any of these discussions or any of these moments, or was there sort of a wine experience during some of these dinners you had with Jimi and friends where a light bulb went off, or something that you recall, or that was just...
It was just constant. I wouldn't say a light bulb went off. I think with Biodynamics, yes, there was probably more of that. Like, oh, this is the right way to do this, or this is why we're doing this. This is why we're stirring, or when we were stirring, something would happen, or looking at a preparation or seeing the results. I think there was more of that. I think that stylistically for wine, it was a continuing education. It still is. We're doing things this year differently than we did last year, and I think especially in Oregon, if you do the same things every year, you'll eventually end up making some poor wines, because every year here is different, and you need to be responsive to that year and to that vineyard location. So I think that not only back then, but right now, it's still an ongoing and evolving process. I think there's certain things that certainly now I remember some aha moments, like, oh, this is what I like, and this is why I'm doing this. 100% whole clusters were one of those things. But back then, I think we were really experimenting a lot, and it was more, I think, on the viticulture side that we were having those aha moments, as opposed to on the winemaking side.
Are there any kind of stories, kind of Jimi stories that?
There's a lot of Jimi stories, but I don't know if I want to share them on camera.
I've heard that several times in different interviews, but is there anything that's like a kind of a typical thing or something that you recall that?
I mean, there, you know, I would say one thing that brings me back every year is I can't remember the first year that it started. I mean, I remember the first time we did this with Jimi, my wife and I, but I don't remember what year it was. It must have been back in maybe 98 or maybe even earlier, maybe even 97, and that's going mushroom hunting at harvest. And there was a particular spot in the Coast Range that Jimi had learned about, and he took us to, and you know, we'd always bring cigars and some beer and go out and we, you know, Jimi was from Oregon, from Beaverton really, and he always thought he was sort of this Eastern European Jew, and you know, Russian, they like the mushroom hunting, so you know, we'd go out and go mushroom hunting, and then we'd go back to someone's house and cook up a huge feast of chanterelles. And the one place that we used to go with Jimi actually got logged before Jimi passed, and then we went and found another place that wasn't too far away. And I have so many memories of mushroom hunting with Jimi, and I still do it every day. I mean, not every day, but every harvest. I have to go once a year to go mushroom hunting, even if it's by myself. I went last week and just took off to the place, and I didn't find much. It was a bad year for mushrooms, but enough to sort of, you know, maybe a couple pounds or something. Whereas in some years we'd go in with Jimi or without Jimi, and you could fill a 5-gallon bucket in 20 minutes. But this year wasn't a good mushroom year. But for me, it wouldn't be harvest, and I wouldn't have that connection going back to Jimi without that. And it's just an important thing that I do, and it's an important way, I think, for me to retain or to keep in touch with his presence and that memory. I mean, there's a lot of other stories that are, you know, usually involve alcohol and guns, but that, you know, I remember, you know, New Year's Day, 2000, January 1st, 2000, you know, sitting down at our house in Dundee with Jimi and drinking rosé champagne, and then we had a big burn pile on our property at that point, and hanging these cans of gasoline and going out with a shotgun and taking shots and trying to set the thing on fire. Or you know, I remember every year Jimi and I used to, and my wife Cheryl, we used to have a harvest party before harvest, and we had it at his house sometimes, and then it got moved to our property when we bought it in Dundee, and we'd roast a whole animal. So, you know, we'd have a goat on the spit or a lamb, and I just, you know, remember those with Pascal as like a little kid in camouflage, playing in the dirt, and you know, I mean, there's. It's funny, most of the memories that I have with Jimi, I remember some tough memories as well, certainly. I mean, there were some hard, you know, emotional times of him going through relationships, of me going through my relationship, that he was always there for me, I was there for him. But I think a lot of the stories I would have with Jimi probably go back to, at least the most fun ones, with food and wine and lots of laughter and generally some long nights, but really good times. You know, just he was a fairly big guy, and he was really solid, and that was his personality. You could always really depend on him.
So it's, you know, kind of wine in just in your back of the table and with meals and that sort of thing. So it seems like just with the community here, that the food and the celebration aspect of wine, it's not just, you know, I guess it's a part of a bigger piece of people's lives.
Well, I mean, that's the lifestyle, right? You know, that we say, oh, winemaking, the great lifestyle, and actually, it's a tough lifestyle. You don't get paid a lot of money. You work, especially during harvest, long hours. It's very physical work. You know, you look at the guys in the vineyard that are out pruning in the pouring rain in the winter. However, it's that community. The lifestyle is the community of sitting down to the table and looking at wine as a food, as an accompaniment, as a thing to bring people together. And once again, it's that cool thing with wine that if I were to go out and buy, you know, I've got my kids were born in 2002. just thinking about 4th of July at Jimmy's house when my son got stung by a bee the first time. But 2002, 2005, and 2007. And I bought a bunch of wine for them for their birth years and put it in the cellar. And so when they pull out a 2005 or a 2002, whatever it is, their experience with that is going to be of me giving that wine to them, probably some memory, if I've passed on, some memory that they have of me, their memory of their birthday, if it's their 21st birthday or whatever, that they're drinking that wine and they're creating this new memory. But it also is that, let's say, a 2005 Chambertin from Rousseau. It's that love and that care and that energy put into that bottle as well from the winemaker and from that vintage. And so, that it's like a magnet that draws us all to the table. It's really cool. I think the difficult thing is now, which I've tried to focus on more and more, is just appreciating wine for what it is, not trying to analytically tear it apart. Just get enjoyment from it and enjoy it with the food. And I used to believe that the wine should be the centerpiece of the table. It's a wine. You build the meal around the wine. And I still think that there's certain wines you do that. If you've got a 1949 DRC or a 1929 Margaux, or you still want that to take the center spotlight. But however, most of the time, 95% of the time, you want these two things to support each other. You don't want one to steal the spotlight, because what you want in some ways is the food and the wine as the attraction to bring people to sit down, and the real sustenance, I guess, is the community and the conversation that you have around the table, and the food and the wine just helps bring that together. And so when I think back to my friendship with Jimmy and the times that we saw him, there were so many times, countless times, I just remember sitting around a table with him, be it having a burger on our kitchen table or in a formal restaurant with a lot of food, sitting down and having sharing that meal together and that community. And I think that's one of the important things about wine. But we can never, I think, at the same time, we don't want to overestimate wine's importance. We don't want to underestimate wine's importance as well. It really needs a balance. And I think that once again, it's another funny thing, is a lot of times it all comes back to balance, right? Balance in the wine, balance at the table, balance in the community. And you're going to have a better experience for all of that. And when things become unbalanced, be it balance in the vineyard, when things become unbalanced, it's where not so good things can intercede.
Now, do you have, there are a lot of people kind of starting out, Jimmy actually was just starting to get going and
Yep.
kind of struggling along.
Yeah, we both were. Yeah.
At that time, but what if some people were at the point you were at then? Do you have any advice or kind of wisdom you would impart to somebody who's kind of at that point, or even earlier? They're kind of thinking, okay, maybe where you were when you were in Los Angeles at the wine shop. What would you say to somebody who says, okay, I want to get into this, I want to do this?
I'd probably say, this sounds so California, but go for it. I think my one regret probably is I didn't start making wine sooner. Now, who knows if I had started sooner, if the stars would have aligned just the way they had now, if the opportunities that I've been given would present themselves in a different life, if we would be this big. I don't know, but what I do know is that if I started earlier, I would have been as Tom Waits said, rolling my own sooner. I think that's a big jump from working for someone to working for yourself. And if that's what you want to do, not everybody wants to do that. I've got some winemaker friends that never want to work from, they just want to be a winemaker, they like the security. But it's that realization of, I can roll my own. That was a huge step, and I wish I'd done that earlier. And I would advise people that want to do that to try to find a way to do that earlier, because if you don't do it, you'll never know if you can or you can't. And if you have the slightest inclination of doing it, you should go out and do it. You only have at best 60 chances to do this in your lifetime, and not all those 60 chances are going to be great. And the sooner that you can get to do it, the better. And I think that would be my advice. And certainly, it's easier said than done. But it's also easier to do in Oregon than perhaps almost anywhere else in the winemaking world. There's still so much opportunity up here for someone to get going. I mean, I remember when I stepped out on our own, it was the spring of 2001, sort of summer 2001, and you know, I didn't know what I was going to do. I wanted to have a baby, you know, didn't know where I was going to go. Lots of discussions with a lot of people. I talked to Josh Bergstrom about it, talked to Jimmy about it, a lot of other people, talked to Ted Lemon about it, and Ted said, you know, you never know until you hang your chit, your sign outside your door, and you go for it. And I think, you know, in the end, winemaking's not rocket science. You know, in the end, it's a craft. However, what separates the wines that are merely craft wines from the wines that are truly memorable and great is passion. And if you have enough passion, getting to that place sooner rather than later is my advice. You can always, if you have that passion and you're good at what you do, you can always go back and you can always work for someone else. But if you want to do it, you want to do it yourself, get out there as soon as you can.
And then kind of a final on why should people drink or go to Oregon wines, and kind of what's special about this place? You know, there's places with a lot more predictable weather.
Sure.
There's larger producers. You know, why would, if you're going to make a pitch for Oregon, how would you tell somebody who's never tried it? Or
You know, everybody's got their own preferences, so I can't convince anybody to like a wine or to not like a wine. And I think it's crazy to me to give up on a vintage or a wine because the Miles character in Sideways says Merlot is shitty. No, I mean, I still like Merlot. I drink Merlots. I don't like them all. You know, I tend to not prefer Bordeaux, but there's people that love Bordeaux. So I don't think anybody should really be. A consumer of wine should be going out there and finding what they like, and not listening to anybody else. Listen to people for advice, but then decide on what they like. And so I find it difficult to tell people to like my wine. I tend to soft pedal the marketing because I'm not really a marketer. I just make the wine and I make it the best I can and put it out there and hope people will like it. However, if people, I think there's two things that make Oregon special. And one is, and this is perhaps not alone being Oregon, but I do think there's one thing that makes Oregon special, and that is the climate. We have a challenging climate here. We don't have the same weather all the time, and we're not consistent, right? So each year tastes different, and for me, variety is the spice of life, right? If I had to drink the same wine all the time, I would go crazy. I like the differences in the wine. It's almost like in Oregon, you're taking a picture, you know those pictures of, they're taking like a picture of a certain place once a year, right? And for me, that's like Oregon. You're taking this picture of this vineyard, but every year is different, and so that the picture is slightly different. And for me, that's great. It's mysterious to try to figure out why that. It's exciting to figure out the new vintage and to taste the new vintage. I think in warmer climates and more consistent climates, you don't have that variability. And if you can't tolerate the variability, then those, you know, Oregon wines may not be for you. However, I think the greatest Oregon winemakers, or the very good Oregon winemakers, will always make wines of high quality. But that quality will be seen through the lens of the vintage, which I think is really great. And you know, it'd be extremely boring for me to taste, you know, let's say 2000 through 2010 Willamette Valley Rex Hill Pinot Noir and have it all taste relatively the same. And Oregon gives you that difference. The other thing I think it gives you is a integrity of fruit, even in riper vintages like last year or 2009, that there's always going to be a freshness that harmonizes with food at the table. They're not cocktail wines. They're not wines, I find, that you sip by themselves and not really think about it. I call that more hedonistic wines. And in Oregon, I don't really think we make hedonistic wines so much. We make more intellectual wines. So they're wines that cause you to pause and to stop and to take a taste and to think about it, and that support the food once again and work really well with the food and wake you up. They make you lighter instead of heavier. And I think lastly, most producers in Oregon, if not all, are small artisanal producers. A to Z is on the bigger side of the scale, but we're still not huge in the terms of in the whole wine world. And we're still making wines because we want to be here, because we're passionate about what we do, and because we think we're making wines from a special place. We're not just making wines because it's a job. We're making wines because we all want to be here. And I think that passion is a really big difference. We're not making beverages. We're making Oregon wines, and that's a really important thing. And I don't think you find that everywhere in the wine world.
So, just jumping back to kind of the old
Sure.
Pinot Noir.
So I think that young Pinot Noir is really pretty, but old Pinot Noir, as it's evolved in the bottle and aged, is really beautiful. And I think there's a lot of characteristics of humans in that. As you're young, we generally tend to be really pretty and vivacious, but as we get older, we're perhaps not so pretty, but we're deep in wisdom, and we're deep in experience, and we're deep in not just surface prettiness, but real true beauty. And I think that the two regions in the world that have that track record consistently are Burgundy and Oregon. And I lived in France. I respect the French culture. I respect the wines, but I realized I'm an American, and I needed to be in America. I wasn't built to be an expat. And I looked around and found the only other place that I could find that true sort of holy grail that I was chasing, that aged Pinot Noir, and not just aged and hanging on, but aged and complete and complexing and becoming something else and transforming, was in Oregon. And I think that's a pretty unique statement of why Oregon wines are really special.
Well, great.